Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good. You're probably wondering why I chose this. This was not today, but yesterday, actually, the 90th anniversary of the kidnapping of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. And it is a case that is still hotly debated to this day. I found so many websites. One of the more interesting ones, and they quoted a book that believes that Lindbergh himself actually may have killed his son by accident, and it was a cover-up. I can't really give you much credence on that, but it just shows you there are podcasts and websites and innumerable books, magazines. I've used quite a lot of things. Wikipedia was a big help, and quite a few things. Okay, quite a few things. There we go.
A little closer.
Okay, yeah, but quite a few things turned up. And I mean, there are large parts of myth to Lindbergh's story in general. And I'm going to sort of introduce you to one of them, which I found somewhat whimsical. So let's get going. Right. Well, here he is, the lone eagle. There's a very heroic portrait of him. And I mean, he was really, his feat was so incredible for its time. It was on the level of the 1969 moon landing to people of that generation, because he was like the 100th man to fly across the Atlantic. 42 men did it in one flight in a British dirigible. But what made it noteworthy is that he flew from west to east against the prevailing winds. And this took 33 hours. And he declined to carry a radio because they were so bulky and heavy. He felt he needed to save weight. And if you go to Washington on the Smithsonian, they actually have the Spirit of St. Louis. It's there. In fact, the Smithsonian even has the packing crate he sent the plane to them in. So there's a lot of things going on with him. But this flight was so extraordinary at the time that he wound up getting the first Distinguished Flying Cross from President Coolidge. He got a full-length ticker tape parade of Broadway in New York, in which 4 million people were believed to have attended. And he became Times Magazine's Man of the Year for 1928. So let's move on. All right. Okay. So this is part of the lore you'll see. This is the title song of the show that Lindbergh did not see. He was given tickets to see it because the weather was not good. He was feeling really bad, and they said, well, this is one of the hottest shows in town. Let's take him there. And when he got to the theater, they got a phone call saying, get back out here. The weather is clearing for tomorrow morning. And that's exactly what he did. So he spent the rest of the night preparing the Spirit of St. Louis. It didn't, and he took off the following morning. But it's part of the lore of Lindbergh. And he did actually get to see the first act of this show when he returned, but he had a speaking engagement at a dinner party, of which there were hundreds. And he never did see the whole show, but it is associated with him. It's part of Broadway history. Okay, come on, let's moving on. There. Well, anyway, after that, he basically promoted, the possibilities of air travel. And it was a very difficult thing because, for instance, if you wanted to fly from New York City to Los Angeles in 1927, 1928, you had to fly to someplace like Akron, Ohio, and either spend a night in a hotel or take an overnight train to like someplace like Kansas City and hop across the entire country, because there were airfields, but they were not lit. There was absolutely no way to land a plane after dark. And later on, the US government spent a lot of time and money, and you can still find them. These are these immense concrete arrows that were once lighted, and pilots could look down and see that if they were heading west, they would follow the arrows pointing west. If they had towers and beacons and everything. This is all pre-radar, and they actually did seem to work. But this article I thought was very interesting, because this flight to Mexico turned out to be actually sort of momentous for him personally, because that's how he met his wife, Anne Morrow. She was the daughter of the US ambassador to Mexico, and she was visiting her father for the holidays. She was in college at the time, and they just sort of really seemed to like each other. So anyway, this is after their marriage. This is them in a plane. They made many trips in Asia, across the United States, South America, and they were known as the first couple of the skies, because Anne was a pilot in her own right, which was very unusual. They actually have a category called the 100. These were the first 100 women, including Amelia Earhart, who actually got a pilot's license. So anyway, everything was going very well for the Lindberghs until this. This is a house they got in Amwell Township in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, which is a beautiful part of the state. I used to live in that state, so I know. And Highfields was a really nice house. And they sort of chose it because it was just far enough from New York and Philadelphia to discourage nosy reporters and fans, but it had a good enough road and rail network. So if Lindbergh had to go someplace, he could. And everyone thought everything would work out very, very well there. But on March 1st, 1932, everything changed. And their 20-month-old son, Charles A. Lindbergh Jr., was kidnapped from his second floor window. And this is a contemporary poster and reward. It's $50,000 for Lindbergh baby, which would be over $1 million today. And I mean, this is from, there's a great website, if you haven't run across it, called Chronicling America. And the Library of Congress has digitized newspapers from all around the United States. And it's actually good for genealogy too. I have actually found relatives that were mentioned in the paper, because if they came from a small city or town, everything was news. I mean, everything, even on our own paper here, the Daily Commercial, you'll see these articles saying that so-and-so has returned from a visit to relatives in Miami or something like that. I mean, everything was grist for these papers. So they're really good to find out a contemporary spin on things. And these are from the New Jersey State Police Archives, and these are, they took over the investigation immediately, and that is the ladder. It was a homemade ladder that actually broke. And so they're examining it. And later on, the case was taken over by the FBI, because President Roosevelt took an interest in it. And what happened is part of the ransom requested were in gold certificates, which the United States had started phasing out. And they figured that was enough justification to get the FBI to take the case away from New Jersey. Although I've seen websites that said that both organizations actually bumbled the investigation very badly. And the only thing I can tell you is that they probably were both extremely new organizations at the time. And there are a lot of things that they didn't have that we now take for granted. And we'll get into that a little more later on. Now, this is the head of the investigation. And if Norman Schwarkopf sounds a little familiar, he is the father of the Gulf War general. And he was the first director of the state police. So he not only handled the initial parts of this investigation, but one of his other concerns was trying to maintain order during Orson Welles' Martian radio broadcast that caused some people to panic. So it was an eventful term for Mr. Schwarkopf. No, one of the things, I got this from the New Jersey State Archives, and one of the things they won't show about the case is they won't show where the baby was found, his remains. They have them, they tell you they have them, but they're not showing it on the internet. And there's sort of this general agreement not to show them. So I even looked in a lot of newspapers, and even then, most of the newspapers at the time didn't show it because he was found 2 months later. So animals had gotten to the body. They showed pictures of his pajamas and underwear, but they won't show the actual remains. And this is one of the initial wanted posters. And they say, son of Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh, world famous aviator. And so they were really casting a wide net, trying to find out what happened. Now here's the first ransom note. There were actually 13 of them over the next couple of years. And the final one demanded $100,000. So that's basically something like over $2 million now. That was quite a chunk of change. And in meeting the kidnappers, a Bronx resident, he was a doctor named Condon, he offered himself to the authorities to actually meet with the kidnapper and try and negotiate the ransom and be the drop-off person. So he did that, and they actually met in St. Raymond's Cemetery, which funny prompted a memory because I used to work with someone who, whenever she did something stupid, she'd say, you know, you can do better than that, St. Raymond's girl. So she actually went to the school and the church that cemetery belonged to. And the person he spoke to, he called himself John. So this is where the ransom money came from. This is a contemporary of the US Federal Reserve Bank in New York, which is still there. It's built like early Renaissance Venetian palazzo, and it's quite imposing. And of course, that's not the first ransom that came from out of there, but this shows you how secure they are and everything. Now, these are some of the early suspects. Dr. Condon, of course, upper right, he was, of course, a suspect. And the other ones were Betty Gow, and she was a maid in the household, and she was asked to be requestioned by the authorities, and she inexplicably swallowed poison and killed herself, which led to a lot of speculation. And later on, they cleared her. Time-wise, there was just no way that would have worked with her. But you just sort of wonder, did she know something? Did she know the kidnappers? Because you have to think that maybe somewhere this was an inside job. I don't know, it's just speculation. And the last one was, so we have Violet, we have Betty. Betty was the nurse. She was the last one to see the child alive. And she was clear too. And this is always one of the weirdest things. The authorities had complicated arrangement where people were coming in and saying they did it. They wrote letters to the authorities saying, I did it. And this happens in every high profile case. But the police still have to check on that. So they check on no matter how wacko it sounds, they have to follow it up. And this guy, he actually wrote a full-page letter in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle admitting that it was all a hoax. He had nothing to do with kidnapping whatsoever. And this is some sort of early profiling. They put together what they believe to be a sketch of the suspect kidnapper. And one of the things that occurred to me is that the times being what they were, I don't think it even occurred to them that the kidnapper could have been a woman. I mean, women carry 2-year-old babies all the time. Well, finally, 2 months later, they found his remains. And, Lindbergh baby killer, terrific blow. So it was blunt force trauma that actually left a hole in the skull. I mean, that's how bad this was. And it's possible that he could have fallen from the ladder, which did break, but I don't know. It doesn't the injury seems far superior to what it would have been if he had been dropped, but who knows? You really can't say what it could be. And I mean, as soon as the news got out, I mean, people came from all over to try and see the site. And of course, that complicates the authorities too, because they start tracking around, destroying evidence, footprints, things that may have been left there. Is the cigarette from the kidnapper? Is it from one of the sightseers? And I actually had a personal brush with something like that. When I lived in New Jersey, in the neighboring township, a gas line exploded and there was a column of flame about 100 or so feet in the air. And it was after midnight. And I'm standing outside because I didn't know whether I should get ready to leave or not. It seemed so close at the time, but it really wasn't. We were actually separated by an interstate, so we were a good distance away, but it looked worse than it was. But the thing was, it was like somebody threw down magic seeds and millions of people suddenly were in front of my house. The street was jammed with cars, people all gawking and talking and running around. And 2 young priests came bolting past me because their car had been stopped and because they couldn't get through, and they were running to the housing development across the highway to see if they needed to do last rites. And so, I mean, when something happens, people just appear out of the woodwork. Okay, well, the case went cold after that, except for these stupid, bizarre ransom notes. But this is where they got their break. And you notice some of the things can be a real break, like in the original World Trade bombing in 1993, their break was that somebody used a personal credit card to rent the van the explosives were in when he parked it in the World Trade Center garage. Well, this break was the kidnapper paid for 98 cents of gas with a marked $10 gold note. And the FBI had released a list of serial numbers. And one of the things that sort of alerted the gas station attendant was, who had money to drop $10 for gas for less than $1 worth of gas, which was basically about 5 gallons then. Yeah, because gas was about 19 cents a gallon in those days. So he got suspicious, and what he did is that he wrote down the license plate, because back in those days, the attendant put gas in your car. And so he had ample opportunity to see the plate. And so here we go. Here's Bruno Richard Hauptmann. He was a New York native. He lived in the Bronx, which is where Dr. Condon came from. That's where the kidnapper met, in St. Raymond's. And I mean, they had no other real leads. So they focused the entire investigation on him. Now here's some early CSI. They actually had this chart to compare signatures and handwriting between the kidnapping ransom notes and what Hauptmann actually wrote, because they kept his house under surveillance for some time before they closed in and arrested him. And when they did, he was arrested for first-degree murder. Although, today it possibly could have been manslaughter, but they were going all the way. And this is the gas can. They actually still have that in New Jersey in the archives. And $30,000 with the marked ransom money was in it. Now, all the rest of it, nobody knows what happened to it, which sort of leads to speculation that maybe somebody else was involved and they got away and they let, Hauptmann take the fall. Now, this was very damning evidence, very damning evidence. This is what the New Jersey State Police found. Actually, the state police transferred it over to the FBI at this point, and they found Dr. Condon's actual contact information written in Hauptmann's closet. So, yeah, but it says State Bureau of Identification, New Jersey State Police. So they still actually have that in the archives. Yeah. Now, one of the complications in this whole thing was that when they apprehended Hauptmann, Dr. Condon, who supposedly was the only person to have actually seen the kidnapper, he could not identify Hauptmann in a lineup. But the evidence was so great, not only the thing Condon's contact info was in the closet, they also matched Hauptmann's tools and wood in his garage with the ladder. And $30,000 of gold certificates were in a can in his garage. It just seemed like there was no other way to go. Now, this picture I got from, it was called the famoustrials.com. So I have to give them a plug. And this shows you the Hunterdon County Courthouse, which is still standing. And it's not a very big place, and it's not a very big town. And if you go to this Main Street area, it's it's a favorite. It's got a lot of boutiques and little restaurants and things like that. If you're ever up that way, it's a nice place to go and visit. But it wasn't that time. As you can see, there were literally tens of thousands. People came from all over to try and get in to see this trial. And it just attracted a lot of attention. And they even had celebrity press. This is a picture from digitalcommons.com and showing author Fannie Hurst and Walter Winchell covering it. She was covering it for Vanity Fair. He was covering it for the NBC radio network. So there were newspapers there, radio was there. Radio had 4 networks then. They were all there. And when you think about it, I mean, at the time, New York City had 16 daily newspapers. And then when you count the magazines like Vanity Fair, Cosmopolitan, I mean, everyone who could possibly get there was there. So it was really quite an achievement to be able to actually sit in the courtroom because it's not that big. Occasionally, they have a local theater group who recreate parts of the trial, which is a lot of fun. I had a chance to see that. But another person who was covering it was the author and social commentator H.L. Mencken, and he described this as the biggest story since the resurrection. And so the trial achieved absolutely massive coverage, like I spoke about. And this is actually a picture of Lindbergh from FBI.org, which is a great page to sort of encapsulate and sort of help you digest this whole case. And this is Lindbergh testifying to what happened that night. And well, as you probably no doubt have guessed, the jury, which judged him to be guilty on the charge, and he was electrocuted in the state prison in Trenton. And this is from the New York Daily News in 1934. Of course, they could only do a drawing of the execution. However, if you're really curious to see if they ever actually got a real electrocution picture, all you have to do is Google Ruth Snyder. They took a picture of her in the electric chair when they pulled the switch. And the Daily News actually ran that on their cover with head type this big saying, "Dead." So if you really want to see something, definitely. But the authorities, of course, were absolutely outraged. It was a neat trick how they did it. They brought in a reporter from Chicago who studied Sing Sing prisons layouts, and he actually had a camera strapped to his ankle, and they ran it up his leg into his pocket. So when they pulled the switch, he just starts pulling on this rubber bulb. Snap, snap, snap. But of course, the media was considerably chastened after that. So this is what the New York Daily News did. And now for the Lindberghs, it was sort of a very mixed thing for them after that, because they actually went on, they had 5 more children. Actually, I made a mistake there. I found out later they actually had 6 children in total. They had 5 more. So please forgive me for that. But they never saw Highfields again. It's still in existence. It's not a museum or anything. Last I heard, it was a state home for delinquent boys, which is probably a good location for it because it's not an easy place for them to get back in trouble in like, Trenton or New York or Philadelphia. And they just sold it and left. They retreated to Europe. And while there, he accepted an unfortunate invitation from Adolf Hitler to look at the illegal buildup of planes in the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And that and his meeting with von Ribbentrop and other Nazi people. And later on in 1939, 1940, he was a prominent poster boy for the movement, they called it the America First movement, to not get involved in the European war, which before Pearl Harbor had a considerable popularity among many Americans. But when the war happened, it definitely tarred him with a bad brush. And he sort of went underground, and he did considerable work. He worked for various aircraft companies. And what he did is that he actually toured the South Pacific during the war and helped innumerable times to upgrade our Air Force there in our fight against the Japanese, because they actually had, the Zero was a much superior plane to what we Americans had, and upgrading was needed very badly. But Anne went on to become a celebrated author. She actually, her most famous book is called The Gift from the Sea, and they're still in print. So if you ever wanted to see them, you can probably see them. We probably have some right here in the library. I would check the catalog. And they lived out their lives. He died in 1974, and they were living in Hawaii at the time, and he became an ardent environmentalist and actually a great favorite to many young people at the time for his stance. So he lived long enough to see the moon landing, which he sort of basically kicked off. And she actually lived much, much longer, even though she was a little younger than he, and she actually died in 2001. So I'm quoting from the New York Times obituary about her. So they did have a life together. And the case lives on because this is an original cover of the Agatha Christie book called Murder on the Orient Express. And she wrote this in 1934. So, I mean, literally struck while the iron was hot to while it was still in the public imagination and memory. And it turned out to be probably her best-selling book. And you can still find it. This library has it right on the shelves in the C's, and it's been done. I actually have heard radio versions of this story. I have, of course, they made a movie in 1976, all-star cast, and they just did it again a few years back. Kenneth Branagh did his version. So this is a story that's never, ever gonna die. And this story literally does not die because, as I mentioned before, there are websites, there are books, pro and con. Did Lindbergh murder his own child? And you see in the newspapers that usually men who get very frustrated, they start to throttle the child, and somehow the child winds up dead. I mean, all sorts of weird things can happen. And but there's no proof. I mean, you can find a book, you can read a website saying he did it, or somebody in the, I saw one that said somebody in the household did it, and they just covered it up. So there's really no way. But the kidnapping of Daisy Armstrong, if you remember in the movie, they borrow large parts of it. Like in the movie, the governess was meeting a man in the gatehouse when the kidnapper's car went past them, and she committed suicide, just like Violet Sharp. So they really, really laid it on. And we made a substantial change in the law. From then on, kidnapping is a federal crime as well as a state crime. And you can, that was a major change. I mean, because before, the FBI didn't get involved until federal money, you know, gold certificates turned up. That's when they got involved. And media coverage, it still affects us to this day, because in these really high profile cases, they find out that they are still wary of allowing cameras in the courtroom, radio commentators. they're trying to put a damper down on it to make it a less of a sensation. And of course, they don't want to poison the jury, because after all, they do go home and they see all this coverage and they're not supposed to watch it, but sometimes they do. And so one of the ways they do that is they have a sketch artist come in and draw the people involved, and that's what they show on the news. So whether you know it or not, the Lindbergh trial still is part of our lives in one way or another. And this is something that's gone on ever since then. The FBI has been keeping track of anyone who's known to be kidnapped or missing. And they actually have this website. All of these people are missing. And you can actually go in, anyone can go in and look at it. So that's a remnant of this case. And this is the end. This shows you the crowded courtrooms they had at the time. Look at it. It was absolutely packed. And if you go and see it, you say, this courtroom was smaller than this room, because until then, they never thought they really needed anything bigger. I mean, in the years since, they have a newer, bigger courthouse. But I mean, this was insane. It just, and that's why the media had to be calmed down. The spectators had to be calmed down. Everything since then, when it's a big case, has got to be, they had to ratchet it down. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them.